I have been asked, more than once, why I never moved the woman on from the hall's edge. My steward raised it in autumn. My council raised it in the first frost. She had no rank, no pack, no formal place in my household, only a worn satchel, a quiet step, and the habit of appearing wherever something small needed mending. A hound's torn paw, a latch that wouldn't catch, a pup that had stopped eating. She fixed these things without being asked, took no payment for any of them, and vanished back to the corner of the great hall, where I had set aside a cot and a brazier some weeks before, in a moment I chose not to examine too closely. My wolf had been restless for 2 years, not agitated, not the coiled energy of a battle, not the sharpened edge of a hunt. Restless in the way that means something is unfinished, the way a man keeps returning to a room where he left a thing he cannot name. I told myself it was the border skirmishes. I told myself it was the late harvest, the trade disagreements with the eastern packs, the cold that came early this year and had not yet decided to leave. I told my council that the woman mended useful things and cost me nothing, and they let it rest. My steward noted it in his ledger under the heading of uncategorized charity and did not raise it again. It was Pell who asked the question. Pell is 8, the ward son of a border keeper who died 2 winters back. He runs the length of my corridors before dawn, has opinions about which hounds deserve more food, and is constitutionally incapable of leaving a silence unfilled. I had been watching the woman, Sable I had heard her called, though no one seemed to know if it was a name or a description. Steady a young hound's paw against her knee while the hound trembled and then stilled, and I had been watching without moving for longer than I meant to when Pell appeared at my elbow. "Who is she to you?" he asked, plainly, with the authority of a child who does not understand that some questions are not asked. I did not answer. "You keep looking at her," Pell said. "You don't look at anyone else that long, not even Keth. Keth is my great wolf." The comparison was meant to be conclusive, and in Pell's world, it was. I sent him to find breakfast, but the question lodged the way a splinter does, too small to name, wrong enough to feel every time you pressed it. I went back to the hall an hour later, under the reasonable pretense of reviewing the morning's supply counts. And she was still there. She had moved on from the hound to a torn leather strap on one of the younger pack members' gear, which she was restitching without having been asked, with the focused patience of someone who simply cannot pass a broken thing without stopping. My wolf went quieter than usual. Not still, not the bright arrested stillness of a scent caught, quieter, like a man who has been holding his breath for a long time and has, without meaning to, finally let a little of it go. I told myself this meant nothing. I reviewed the supply counts. I left. That night, someone left a covered bowl of broth on the floor outside my chamber door. It was still warm. There was no note. I stood in the corridor for what was probably an embarrassing length of time, holding the bowl, not going back inside, before I finally did. I drank it. It was very good. 2 days later, I permitted myself to watch her work without pretending to review anything. She was in the yard in the early cold, reteaching a pup who had been skittish since the autumn to accept being handled. Not forcing it, not restraining it, just sitting on the frozen ground in her heavy cloak and waiting, with a patience that had no visible bottom, until the pup decided on its own to come and put its head in her lap. When it did, Sable rested one hand very gently on its side and did not move. Old Marin, who had been my wolf pack's most particular elder for 11 years and had bitten 2 trained handlers in that time, crossed the yard and settled against Sable's knee with the deliberate ease of an animal arriving home. The mark on my wrist, which I had not looked at directly in 2 years, which I had covered with the wide cuff of my winter gloves, and refused to acknowledge, warmed, not blazed, not the full gold fire of a bond confirmed. Warmed the way an ember does when you hold your hand near it. A quiet announcement that the heat is there, has been waiting for you to stop walking away from it. I put my gloves back on and went inside. Here is what I had not told my council, my steward, or anyone else. I had known a woman before. 3 years ago, on the road back from a border accord, I had met a healer traveling alone between villages, and my wolf had recognized her with a certainty that left no room for argument. I had believed for precisely 4 days that I had found what I had been waiting my whole kingship for. On the 5th day, her pack recalled her. A family obligation, a prior bond, a circumstance she had not told me about because there had not been time. She left without asking me to follow, which was its own kind of answer. I put the mark on my wrist under my gloves and told my wolf to settle, and I had been a perfectly adequate and thoroughly hollow ruler ever since. I had not considered that she might, over the 2 years since, have resolved that prior bond, left her old pack with quiet dignity, and ended up in my hall, fixing latches and feeding broth through closed doors. I had not considered it because considering it required a quality of hope I had decided 2 years ago to put down. Pell told me, on a morning when I was staring at the supply counts with the focus of a man who is absolute staring at a woman mending harness leather across the hall, that Sable had told him her family was gone, that she had been walking since the spring, and that she liked my hall because the dogs here were treated kindly. She said she might stay a bit longer, Pell added. If she's allowed. I told him she was allowed. He gave me a look of 8-year-old satisfaction that I chose not to examine. Keth came home wounded 3 days later. A border skirmish, a young pack member's miscalculation, a cut along his left shoulder that was not life-threatening but was deep enough that Keth, who had been my wolf for 12 years and had been handled by 3 different trained healers in that time, decided to trust none of them. He lay on his side in the infirmary and showed his teeth at anyone who came through the door, and the head healer came to find me with the careful expression of a man about to suggest something that might not be welcomed. I was already thinking of Sable before he finished his sentence. She came through the infirmary door the way she did everything else. Without hurry, without announcement, she sat down on the floor beside Keth, not touching him, not speaking, just settling there, the way the pup had settled toward her in the yard. Keth lifted his head. He lowered it again. After a moment, he pressed his nose against her knee, and she rested one hand on the wound, and I watched her work with the slow care of someone who has done this before, who believes that broken things deserve the time it takes to mend them properly. The mark on my wrist blazed, not warmed. Blazed, the full gold fire, the bond alive and declared, undeniable as a winter sun. I heard Sable make a sharp, soft sound and looked up to find her staring at her own wrist, where the same gold light was burning. The assembled pack, my head healer, the 3 nearest wolves, the 2 younger pack members who had followed me in, saw it. All of them. There was no possibility of covering it now, no gloves thick enough, no supply counts in the world. I crossed the floor and crouched beside her and Keth, and said nothing for a moment because there was nothing adequate, and I was, for the first time in 2 years, not trying to be adequate. She looked at the mark, then at me. Her expression was not frightened. It was the expression of someone who has been walking a long road and has just unexpectedly recognized where they are. I didn't know it was you, she said quietly. On the road 3 years ago, when I left, I didn't know you were here. I didn't know you had come back. Keth, between us, exhaled heavily through his nose and closed his eyes in the manner of a wolf who has discharged a great responsibility and intends to rest now. The bond, I said, not a question. Yes, she said. Will you stay? She looked at the mark again. She looked at Pell, who was standing in the doorway where he absolutely should not have been, watching with the expression of someone who has been right about something for quite some time and intends to remember this moment for years. She looked back at me. All right, she said. I named her before the pack that evening, in the great hall with the torchlight on the stone, and the wolves gathered, and Keth lying at her feet with his wound properly dressed, in the presence of the whole household, including my steward, who added something new to his ledger under a heading that was going to require some thought. Pell stood in the second row and did not say I told you so, which showed a restraint I had not known he possessed, and which I made a point of telling him later I appreciated. What I remember most now is not the blazing of the mark or the hall gone quiet or the weight of 2 years of hollow precision finally released. I remember her hand steady on Keth's shoulder in the firelight and the way she had been there, present and patient and unasking, for weeks before I permitted myself to understand it. I had thought the hardest thing would be hoping again. It turned out the hardest thing had already happened. She had simply stayed and waited and left broth at a closed door, and I had been the last one in my own hall to see it clearly. Pell saw it first. He always does.